Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Hope One Show. Is your host Jorge Gil. Today, I am covering for Frank once again. He's been in and out of some of the shows that we've done because, obviously, we all know by now that his dad is not doing well. He's taking care of him. So, again, I want you guys to please pray for Frank's dad, Frank's health, and also for Frank's strength and all his family uh, during this difficult time. I want to thank everybody and the thousands that tuned into our show yesterday, talking to Abdu about his new book that he co-authored with the late Ravi, and also the tributes that we did for Ravi. We also have a tribute coming out through the Why Do You Mean page with John McCrae. Wait for that today. And the tribute that we did on for Ravi on Monday, since Abdu couldn't make it, it was just beautiful. So we want to thank on Tuesday. So I want to thank everybody who's supporting us. You know that we're asking you guys, just like the RZIM family, that if you donate to Cross Examined, to make sure that you can switch those donations for this month to RZIM. We want the work of Ravi and the RZIM ministry to continue for many, many, many years, many decades to come. And right now, make sure that you hit the like button. Make sure you hit the subscribe and the bell if you are in YouTube watching, if you haven't done so. And also make sure you tag friends that you think might benefit with today's show. We're going to have a great speaker, great friend, and an amazing scholar. And we're going to be talking about hope through philosophy and cultural apologetics. You guys know that in order for us to do good theology, in order for us to do good apologetics, we have to have a robust philosophical undergirding and foundation. So we have to make sure that we have that. And our guest today is Dr. Paul Gould. And I'm going to bring Paul. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. It's great to see you, Jorge.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you here. This is long overdue. We talked about this. Then one of the
Yeah.
shows, I was in the middle of something, didn't remember what was going on. And then I had to text you and I'm like, man, I'm so sorry. I've been wanting to bring you to the show for a long time. And now we're finally here. This Hope One show and the whole situation with the COVID has
Yeah.
really helped us to move this forward, to reach the many that are on our social media platforms and they want to have conversations with people like you. So I want to ask you, Paul, to give us your superhero origin story, how you came to the world of philosophy, how do you achieve your goals in terms of your academics, your PhD, what's your PhD in, where do you get it from, and why you got into philosophy.
Okay. Yeah, I like how you frame that, my superhero origin story. I don't know if it's a superhero, but it is my story. Let's see. So became actually back up, became a Christian in college through a campus ministry called Campus Crusade for Christ, or CRU. And so that was when God radically changed my life. And so when I graduated and was married, and both my wife and I had become Christians through CRU, and we had a huge heart for college students. And so we joined that ministry and became campus ministers. And my undergrad degree was actually accounting, and so had no philosophy background. That's why I'm going to give you this origin story. It's kind of fun, actually. Had no background in philosophy, but I noticed some things in my evangelism and sharing about the truth of Christianity on a college campus. I noticed that I always veered toward the intellectuals, or at least those who thought they were intellectuals. And I loved having conversations about the gospel in the context of ideas, and that was something new to me. So I was just kind of noticing that. And then I noticed within my own heart, I call them these passions that began to surface. And again, just being a generalist, a campus minister, suddenly there is these passions to, what do you defend the faith? And what is the truth about this and that? And how does science and theology fit? And so I became interested in things like theology and then apologetics and ultimately philosophy. But because of all the generalist things you do as a campus minister, I had to shove it back under the surface for about 3 years. And I call it a beach ball, this passion for learning. It was like a beach ball that you shove under the surface of your life But as you can just with the metaphor, the beach ball continued to surface, and I'd shove it down and it would surface. And finally, about 3 years into my time as a campus minister, I said, God, what do I do with these passions? How do they fit into my story? And there were two things that happened that third year as a campus minister that set me on the path to where I am today. The first was actually in the Bible study I was leading. We were going through the Gospel of Luke, and in the Gospel, Luke, there's a number of times where he basically pauses and says something like, Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem, kind of showing the methodical walk of Jesus toward the cross. And one of those was in Luke 13, I think it's 30, 31, 32, somewhere in there, where Jesus is talking to the Pharisees about Herod. And we are looking at this passage, and Jesus says something like this. He says, you go tell that fox, that's Herod, that I will continue on toward Jerusalem until I reach my end, or my telos, or my purpose, which for him was the cross. And it kind of dawned on us as a group. One of the guys said, I bet you Jesus was very passionate. And it dawned on me that he was passionate, likely passionate, and he was passionate in light of his end or his purpose. And it was kind of like God just was speaking into my heart. You will be most passionate about the things of God as you understand your unique end, my unique end or telos or purpose for you. So that's like the first track that God laid to say you need to go be a niche player in the kingdom of God. The second track took place that summer. Now I'm in Virginia Beach and doing a summer project. I'm testing that beach ball. I'm teaching apologetics to students, learning things about myself, that I have abilities to communicate, learning things about my students, that they have needs in these areas. And I was actually at church one day, and somebody was sharing their testimony or their story of faith. And they shared this quote, and it's actually dating him, but they shared this quote about the movie Chariots of Fire. So I don't know if your listeners have heard of this, if you know of Eric Liddell.
Yeah.
But in there, he basically says this quote. He says, when I run, I experience God's pleasure. I can remember asking myself, God, what is it that when I do it, I experience your pleasure? And it was just this immediate answer, sharing the gospel in the context of ideas. And that was the second track that God laid to say, you need to go be a niche player in the kingdom of God. So quicker story from there, went to Talbot School of Theology to cut my teeth in philosophy, sort of as an introduction. From there, went to Purdue University and got a PhD in philosophy, and then began to teach. And as you're teaching philosophy, that's when I discovered, my soul sings in the classroom. This is what God made me for. This is that purpose. And so that kind of got us to where we are today.
Definitely a superhero origin story, man. Absolutely. Yeah, that would make for a great clip right there. Thank you for sharing that with us and our audience.
You're welcome.
Now, as any good philosopher ought to do, define what philosophy is.
That's right. And as any philosopher knows, it's actually harder to define things than you would think. Even sometimes I ask my students, define a chair, and you'll find out that it's not as easy as you think to define a chair, even though we're all sitting on them and we know what they are. So here's how I would define philosophy simply, is the pursuit of wisdom and knowledge for the sake of flourishing. And within that, Plato in the Republic, he makes this distinction between things that are good for the benefit they bring, or things that are just good in themselves, and as well as a third category, things that are good in themselves and for the benefit they bring. And I think that philosophy is in that third category. Knowledge and wisdom are both good in themselves, so it's valuable, intrinsically valuable, but it's also good for what it brings, namely flourishing. And so it helps us understand how to live life well, and not only for our own flourishing, but really for the flourishing of all.
Okay. You first told us how you came to Christ through Thru. Then you told us how you got into philosophy, apologetics, and teaching. Why philosophy? What is the value for a Christian? What is his value for a Christian? I mean,
oh man, so much. I mean, you even said at the beginning of the show here, that we want to be good theologians, good apologists, good philosophers. I mean, the reality is this, that God has created us as thinking creatures, right? Aristotle said that we're rational animals, and that's something that's unique about us. There's more that's unique about us, but no less, right? That we are thinking creatures. And so if we want to live life well, we want to be correctly related to reality, right? And so we do that by using our minds to explore truth. And in fact, God has created us that way, right? We have this deep longing for truth. And we're going to talk about other longings we have too, but we have this deep longing for truth. And philosophy is that discipline that aids us in that study. And I would just say the cheap value today is that we live in an that's largely anti-intellectual, and so we no longer think. And the reality is, ideas matter, right? They have consequences. There's raging debates about, should we wear masks or not wear masks? Should we open the economy? Should we not open the economy? Those are real life debates. Of course, there's more perennial questions. Does God exist? Does God not exist? What is the nature of the good life, and so on? These are all philosophical questions that we long to know the truth of, and philosophy can help us in those ways.
Excellent. So what is the relationship now that you're a Christian,
Yeah.
we call ourselves Christians, we follow our Lord Jesus Christ, and we believe in this thing called Christianity. So how does philosophy relate to Christianity? What is the relationship between faith and reason? Because the atheist would say, well, you can have faith or you can have reason, but you cannot have the
Yeah.
both at the same time.
That's right. That's right. By the atheist or even the intelligentsia that faith is irrational,
Hmm.
or blind, or a leap in the dark, or like that. But biblically and even sound thinking is completely the opposite. Here's how I would think of it. You go back to the etymology of the word philosophy. So philosophers like to, in introductory classes, we like to point out that philosophy comes from two Greek words, philo or philein, which is to love, and then Sophia, which is wisdom. So philosophy is literally or etymologically the love of wisdom. It's interesting, if you go to Plato's Republic, it's actually more scandalous than that, though. Plato puts it this way, that the philosopher is wisdom's lover, that we're moved by, this pursuit of truth. So, okay, so if that's what philosophy is, and then, you go to the pages of Scripture and you read things, for example, in Colossians 2:3, where it says, in Christ are hidden all treasures of wisdom and knowledge.
Mm.
And so if philosophy is the pursuit of wisdom, and in Christ are all treasures of wisdom and knowledge, what you see is there's actually a tight connection. And of course, Scripture never pulls head and heart together. Faith is always intellectual faith, right? It's got an intellectual component. Of course, it's got a trust component, but it's reasonable. So it's a convergence, I would say. You look at Paul, you look at Jesus. They used evidence, they used their minds, they gave reasons. I would argue Jesus is not merely a philosopher, but he is a philosopher. Paul used philosophy, was very favorable to it. So yeah, a very tight connection between philosophy and our faith.
I love it. I like to always remind my audience when I'm speaking in Latin America.
Yeah.
We down there we have this tug of war that I know that happened here a few decades ago between this whole idea, reason, philosophy, Christianity and reason, philosophy and theology. Interestingly enough, in Latin America, they go to certain verses to point out how philosophy is bad. I know one of the Paul letters
Yeah.
says, don't have anything to do with vain philosophies, and they harp
Right.
on that and say, hey, you shouldn't be looking at philosophy. I had a friend of mine that he was more on the charismatic side, and he said, man, you shouldn't be doing reading all of that philosophy. And I said, well, so you're telling me that I should be doing X, Y, and Z? And he said, yes. Is that your philosophy? And
It's
he
good.
just stopped and said, you know what, you have a point there. But I think it's very important for the Christian to know that how did the saying go? Theology is the queen of the sciences, and philosophy is her handmaiden.
Handmade.
So, yeah,
That's right.
I
Hmm.
remember talking to Dr. Wing Corduan, and philosophy. I think it's Theology's Handmaiden, and it's a book on philosophy. I was talking to him the other day, and I cannot stress enough the importance of being clear thinkers. My mentor, Richard Howe, my professor and mentor, Dr. Richard Howe, um, keeps just, I mean, on a monthly basis, telling me, hey, remember that if you're a good philosopher, you're gonna be a good theologian and a
Yeah.
better apologist. So I think that you went the route that I want to go in terms of education. I think that if I get a degree in something, it's gonna be philosophy. Now you have a book that you have several books. I know we have this you co-author with our good friends Travis
Yep.
Dickinson and Lofton, but you also have this book, this Cultural Apologetics that I want to talk to you about. And I have the DVD series, and I also have the book here. And I want you to tell me a little bit what is cultural apologetics and how it is different for you from other kinds of apologetics.
Yeah, really enjoyed writing that book. So here's how I define, since definitions matter, I define cultural apologetics in that book as working to reestablish the Christian voice, the Christian conscience, and the Christian imagination so that Christianity will be viewed as true and satisfying. And so there's a few things in that definition that are interesting and a little more broad. Typically, apologetics is usually defined as the rational defense of the faith. And of course, that is so critical to apologetics. But I'm adding that because, as we think about culture, there's more objections. There are objections to the faith, along the lines of your faith in God is irrational. We talked about that. Of course, that's out there. The new atheists, the new atheists, they like to, just argue that there's nothing reasonable about your faith. But there's other objections as well, and they get to the desirability of our faith. The God of the Old Testament is a moral monster, or Christians are hypocrites, or the problem of evil. How could you worship a God that allows horrendous evil like pandemics and things like that? And so the challenge is not just to the truth, but to the goodness and the beauty of faith as well. And so my claim is that Christianity is not just true to the way the world is, right? That's the reasonable part, but it's true to the way the world ought to be as well. In other words, all the deep longings of the heart for truth and goodness and beauty and justice and love and ultimately for God are satisfied in the Christian story. And so it's basically a broadening out. I would fit so-called rational apologetics as a necessary component to a cultural apologetic. Any apologetic worth its salt has to defend the truth of our propositions. But I'm also making it more broad to take into consideration the fact that we're embodied humans that have longings and that live in culture and we make culture and we're shaped by culture. So that's what I'm doing in the book.
That's really good, man. And so, why do you write it? What's the problem? As a professor, as a
Yeah.
campus minister, having the history that you have dealing with apologetics issues early on, and then with students, why do you write it, and what are you trying to accomplish with the book?
Yeah, the main reason why I wrote it, I'm actually thinking of my kids and my kids' in writing
Mm.
this book. As a campus minister for 16 years with Cru, and now as a professor, one of the questions that animates me is how can the gospel get a fair hearing in our culture today? And so that's why I wrote the book. I mean, I'm always reminded of, and I talk about in the book, Leslie Newbegin. It's a great example. Leslie Newbegin was a missionary that was sent from Great Britain to India in 1936, I think, and he faithfully ministers there for something like 40 years. He comes back in the 1970s to Great Britain to realize that his own sending country had become post-Christian in the time that he was gone, and that he needed to have a missionary encounter, as he put it, with his own culture. And
Mm.
so he wrote this book I think in the late 70s called Foolishness to the Greeks. And in there, he asked what I think is, I call it the crucial question today. And basically, it was this question: how can we have a genuine missionary encounter between the whole way of thinking, living, and perceiving that we call modern Western society and the gospel? And I think that's a great question, because Newbegin understood that the gospel is never proclaimed in a vacuum, and that there's this sort of cultural mindset, there's this cultural emotional response patterns, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's even this kind of social imagination, this way of imagining ourselves in this world that affect whether or not the gospel is viewed as plausible or implausible, desirable or undesirable. And so that's what sort of was driving this, is that Christianity is not getting a fair hearing. We have this image problem. People
Mm-hmm.
think we're and maybe we are anti-intellectual, and we're fragmented, and we view the world the same way everyone else does, as mundane and as ordinary. But
Right.
that's not the way the world is. And so that's ultimately why the problems that I wanted to address is, how does the gospel get a fair hearing in today's culture?
That's pretty good, man, because we definitely don't get one with
Yeah.
ridicule and it's a caricature what passes as Christianity. I remember Ravi saying that if there are four people in a panel, one is a scientist, one is a philosopher, one is a
Hmm.
politician, and then one is a minister, the one that they're going to see as biased is the minister automatically, just because he is
Interesting.
a Christian,
Yeah.
and now, before I ask you the next question, which is I think is very important, everybody go ahead on and make sure you go to the live stream and make sure you hit that share button or tag somebody so this live stream can get to more people. Our idea here in the Hope One Show is to bring hope to everyone and make sure that we bring the scholars to your living room so you can ask them questions. Also, make sure that you start asking questions. Just type the word question in all caps, and then your question, make sure, is in complete English. Is so hard for me to read questions and trying to figure out what you are saying so I can give them to Paul. So make sure that you do that, and my team will be ready to put them in the document so I can read them out to Paul when we get to the Q&A session of the broadcast. Now, Paul, how are longings relevant to apologetics? That's one of the things that I'm really, really curious to know, because most of the apologetics that I engage in, and I'm ashamed to say, is just cerebral. How are longings relevant to the discipline?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And of course, our longing for truth is matters, right? So it's okay that we do the rational, what we could call rational apologetics. We have to. But I think we need to expand. And so as I was writing the book, I came across this chart in a book by Peter Kraft, who's a philosopher. He's good with words, and he talks about how God has given each of us as humans three prophets of the human soul. He's given us a mind, so reason, and he's given us a conscience, and he's given us an imagination. And each one of these prophets is on a quest for the object of our longing. And this is so helpful. So the mind, think of reason. What is reason on a quest for? And the answer, of course, is truth, right? We're seeking this proper object of our longing, which is truth. But the conscience also is part of what it means to be human. We have this moral conscience, and that's on a quest for goodness. And then our imagination is on a quest for beauty. And then this is what I love about it. If you put your theological, cap on and think about it, what is the source of goodness, truth, and beauty? And the answer is Christ. And so as we are on this quest, as we awaken these longings through our longing for truth or our longing for goodness or our longing for beauty, as we walk those planks, we're actually walking toward the source of goodness, truth, and beauty, which is Jesus Christ himself. And I love how Augustine puts it in the Confessions. He says of God, you are the beauty of all beautiful things, and you are the good of all good things. And then I would just add, you're the truth in which all true things point. And of course, then if you think about all of our longings the set of our longings is an inverted triangle. This is, I think, so helpful. You have your surface longings at the top of that triangle, but as you go down, you get your deeper longings. And the deeper longings are these longings that we all have, every human, because of how God has created us, these longings for truth, goodness, and beauty. And that's why we should be giving arguments, right? The rational apologetics. And we can do so much more, though. We can talk about that. But then at the bottom of that apex, the bottom there is what Augustine would call our deepest longing, which is God. So Augustine in the first paragraph of the Confession says, God, our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. So what we're doing in awakening these longings and apologetics for goodness, truth, and beauty is setting them on a journey to ultimately discover the deepest longing of their human heart, which is also, as it turns out, their highest good, which is God himself.
Amen. That's beautiful, man. I am a big fan of storytelling. I'm a big fan of good stories. I am a content creator. I know the power of stories in the day to day with my children as a communicator. But what is the role of the imagination and stories in apologetics? Because I know we've lost this in the last few centuries. I would say I remember the last greatest, I would say, apologist that will do this is of C.S. Lewis or Tolkien, right? So tell me and tell our audience what role the imagination and storytelling plays in apologetics.
Well, yeah. So thankfully, people are beginning to rediscover the importance of story and the importance of imagination. So, you mentioned Lewis. Lewis, of course, is the master cultural apologist. Think of Mere Christianity. It's a great work, but any apologetic work that he does, he always begins with an imaginative situation that we can place ourselves in so that we can understand. So in the problem of pain, he begins with, a disagreement and an argument. Of course, we all get that, right? And then in Mere Christianity, something, this moral tugging in our heart that we have the sense that there's some something that we're obligated to, but we fall short. And these are things that we relate to. And then he begins to imaginatively reason. And so Lewis called the imagination the organ of meaning. And I think that's helpful to understand the role of the imagination. If you think about it, we take in sense perception, all day long. We're looking at trees and tables and, in this case, computer screens. We have our sense data, but the imagination helps us understand that which we perceive so that we can deliver that we can deliver these meanings to our minds to judge as true and false, and then we can act good. And there's a connection between that. And so many people have noticed, many scholars have noticed, that we're narratival animals, sometimes they call it, where we tend to imagine ourselves as part of a story. And that's how we go through our lives. I think that makes sense. Even as we go back to our own origin story, you asked about my origin story. Well, you go all the way back to the beginning of our lives. And I think we have this sense that we come into the world as part of an ongoing story. And then we take up our place in that story. And we're on this quest to find our proper end. And of course, one of the ways that I think this helps in evangelism and in apologetics, I do all the typical, I love speaking on college campuses, and I get asked a lot to speak on the problem of evil or, the existence of God or things like that. And I began to shift a little bit. I still do all the typical, arguments and philosophy apologetics, but I begin with this question, of all the competing stories out there, is there one that understands you? Because there's all these stories that are seeking our allegiance, that are vying for our participation, whether it's naturalism or consumerism or the American dream or the Christian story. And the question is, of all these stories, which one understands you? And this is where the gospel, the good news is there is a story that's alive and that understands us, and it's the gospel story. And in that story, we find the point of all good stories, which is Jesus Christ. And so, I think stories are really important because they, as Lewis again puts it, they help us steal past those watchful dragons of, mere sentimentality on one hand, and then this sort of cold, calculating rationalism on the other. It kind of bypasses those things, gets to our heart, and awakens these longings to live a life that actually matters. And so, that's a little bit on story.
That's deep, man. That when you were answering that question, one of the things that you said is I mentioned something about Mike Heiser earlier when we were in the green room, and it's funny because he wrote a book where he maps out the gospel in the TV Netflix series of the Stranger Things, and people says, "Hey, how?" I mean, we have people on both ends of the stick, if you will, saying a Christian should never look at that, and then the other one saying this is a brilliant way to get people who are not interested in anything Christian to start looking at the best, most important story in the world, and that is the story of Jesus Christ. So I think it's very important that we engage the culture using the methods that captivate their imagination. I think that if we cannot keep their imagination captive with the most beautiful story in the world, then we're not doing our job well. And I mean, kudos to you for really diving deep and bringing us in with you, with this cultural apologetics books and your amazing series of teachings that they're put together by Sondervan. Now, you talk about the culture as disenchanted. Number one, what do you mean by that? And number two, you said that we need to join with God to re-enchant this world. Also, explain that to us, please.
Yeah, so, any cultural apologetic worth its salt needs to first understand the culture that we find ourselves in. And go back to that Newbegin quote that I mentioned earlier, where he asked, what is the dominant way of thinking, living, and perceiving in modern Western culture? And the answer to the question, what is the dominant way of perceiving, is the word disenchantment. And so what I mean by that is that we largely use, that in culture we use words like this to describe the world around us. We say that the world is everyday or ordinary or mundane. And largely this is how Christians view the world as well. But the reality is that's not the way the world is, right? We live in a world that's gift. It's, to use the word Lewis preferred, it's holy, it's sacred, it's mysterious, it's full of deep meaning and beauty and love. It's an enchanted world. And so disenchantment is a word that a lot of scholars have picked up. It comes from Max Weber, but it's this idea that the world has been emptied of its transcendence. It's been emptied of the divine or the sacred, and it's just mundane. There's nothing beyond this world we live in, as Charles Taylor would put it, an immanent frame where all of life can be made sense of without reference to anything beyond this world. So that's broadly what disenchantment means. And my claim is that we live in a disenchanted world in this sense. The dominant way of perceiving the world around us is that there's nothing beyond the immanent frame of naturalism. When I argue so that's kind of a descriptive part of the project, right? Understanding our culture. On the more prescriptive part of the Cultural Apologetic project, one of the claims I make in the book is that we can actually join with God to re-enchant the world. And so I'm hopeful here. And there's actually, I have a theological reason for that. Maybe we can get into this. But what I mean by that, let me just tell you what I mean by joining with God to re-enchant the world. I mean two things. Number one, that we would learn to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And then number two, we would invite others to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And if you ask the question, well, how did Jesus see the world? Well, he saw it as God infused and God bathed. God is not some distant being that exists outside a clockwork universe. No, God is active and present in our lives and in history. And he's right here with us. I mean, I know we're on a Zoom call or whatever, but he's here, right? He's right here with us. And that's the world that we live in. And I would just argue, or I would say, start by reading the Gospels. I'm reading Acts right now. And, I'm reading in the part where Paul is just shipwrecked in the I think it's chapter 25, and an angel appears to him and gives him a message that he and his crew are going to be saved, and that's just like part of the normal world that he lived in, and he's healing people, and there's prayers, and I know there's a huge theological debate about all that, but the point is the world, however we cash out our theology of things like that, the world is God-bathed and God-infused, and it's gift, it's sacred, it's sacrament. And I think if we begin to look at the world that way and re-enchant our own lives, we will begin to help others see the fingerprints or the clues of God that are everywhere around.
That's great, man. Yeah, definitely. And what would you say are some helpful metaphors to help us understand, this secular, this disenchanted culture, devoid of this, spiritual aspect? And what are some better metaphors to help us understand it?
Yeah, there's a couple metaphors, again, to help us understand the dominant way of perceiving or so like Charles Taylor, who's a philosopher, Catholic philosopher, really important philosopher, wrote a huge book called The Secular Age. It's 900 pages. You probably don't want to try it, but there's a great summary of it written by Jamie K.A. Smith called How Not to Be Secular. And I would recommend that if you're interested in these ideas. One metaphor that comes actually from a Jewish sociologist, but I'm going to borrow, is the metaphor of a broken cord. And so the idea is that prior to this culture, this age that we find ourselves in, every culture prior to this one believed there was a tight connection between the sacred and the natural order, that they were tightly intertwined. But today that cord has been severed. So that's one metaphor that helps us understand people's dominant way of imagining the world they find themselves in. Another one that I think comes more from Taylor, we'll just call it the dungeon. And this is the idea that we live in, as I already mentioned, this immanent frame, right? There's nothing beyond this world. And so we're stuck in this dungeon seeking meaning, as Nietzsche would say, cast on a vast sea of nothingness. So it's kind of a bleak way to understand this world. Maybe a third one, I'm going to borrow from Jamie K. Smith. He wrote a whole trilogy called the Cultural Liturgies series. And I like one of the discussions. I'm going to just use the metaphor of the shopping mall. Now, this is interesting. We live in a time of pandemic where the shopping mall is really struggling. But in many ways, it's this idea that we are consumers who are defined, I shop, therefore I am. And so these are kind of three dominant metaphors for understanding the disenchanted world we live in. Let me just quickly replace them with what I think is a more biblical and helpful social imaginary or way of conceiving our way. Instead of the broken cord, I would argue that we live in a sacred tapestry. And again, I'm using some language now from the theologian Hans Boersma, who has a book by that title, where everything is tightly connected. The sacred and the social orders are connected. And what I mean by that is everything in this world points to and illuminates something about the sacred order. And by sacred order, I mean God's enacted plan to create, sustain, and redeem all of this world. So instead of a broken cord, it's a sacred tapestry. instead of a dungeon, um, a theater of God's glory. I love how Calvin put it
Mm,
in the Institutes. He says the heavens and the earth are a theater of God's glory. Everything points to God. Okay, so a theater instead of a dungeon, and then finally, instead of a shopping mall, how about the metaphor of a home? You know, if you think about it, the
mm,
deepest metaphor of the human heart is the home. It's the place where we ideally, right? It's a place where we're known and we know. It's a place where we belong and where our presence and acceptance is felt. And that's what we long for. And that's the world that God has made. And that's
mhm.
the world that God is renewing and restoring as you know, we follow through the gospel story. So those would be, I think, metaphors that I would encourage us to think and meditate on and imagine ourselves as part of.
I love it, man. Yeah, with being a part of God big family,
Yeah.
the whole idea
Yeah.
of the home. And now that we are in this quarantine, we are
We're
all
home.
in our house, in our homes.
Yeah.
That really hit, I know it's redundant, but it hits home, right? When we think about these things. Now, Paul, for everybody out there that might want to get your cultural apologetics book, and they should go get it. Tell them, if they're interested in apologetics, if they're interested in philosophy, why they should go get a copy.
Oh, well, that's a great question. Yeah, because I think we all, as human beings, want to live a life that matters, right? And we want to live a life where we flourish the way God intended, and we want to be used, right? We want to
Mm-hmm.
live a life that, where God is, we're a part of a story that matters. And in that story, so it's interesting, I wrote this book, Cultural Apologetics, but people have been talking about how it's helpful for discipleship, that it actually
Mm.
helps us in our own spiritual journey. So I would say if you want to understand how to have a conversation with anyone in culture, if you want to understand better the role of our longings in our spiritual formation and in evangelism, and if you want to understand the idea that we are the relationship between culture and how we make it and it shapes us in turn, and how that affects what it means to be faithful in this 21st century, I would say check out the book. Plus,
Check
there's
it out.
lots of cool stories because we are story animals. So
Absolutely, man. I love that.
yeah.
Now, God is using you in many different levels. But now, as people can see in the lower third, is we have pba.edu, Palm Beach Atlantic University. Tell us a little bit about your new role at this institution.
Yeah, so this is happening hot off the press, I guess. So we put it in the little thing there. But yeah, so this fall I'll be joining Palm Beach Atlantic, which is in West Palm Beach, Florida, and then in the fall of 2021 we will be opening a new master's in the philosophy of religion. And so yeah, when a lot of universities are shuttering their doors when it comes to philosophy because
Mm-hmm.
there's this big debate in the academy at large. If knowledge doesn't show some non-cognitive benefit, then it's hard to justify itself. But again, I've already claimed that philosophy is not only valuable in itself, so it doesn't need any justification, but it is
Right.
valuable for what it brings. And so we're committed at Palm Beach Atlantic to that claim that philosophy actually matters for the sake of our culture, for the sake of human flourishing. And so we're going to launch a new MA, a new master's in philosophy. And so
Awesome.
I would just invite students who are interested in whether it's a PhD in philosophy or related disciplines. It doesn't have to be philosophy. This would be a great place for you to come and study. Whether you want to work in the parachurch or a church, or just to be a public intellectual, we're actually going to have a program with a class on public philosophy and recapturing
Wow.
this idea that Christians are public intellectuals. Of course, we're going to do top-notch philosophy and metaphysics and epistemology and philosophy of science and philosophy of religion. But of course, there's going to be the cultural apologetics piece. Right now, it's going to be myself and Paul Copen, who also
Mm-hmm.
teaches there. But Lord willing, we're going to grow the program and we're going to grow our faculty. And so we have a vision for, we think that philosophy is obviously important. And we want to be a place on the Eastern Seacoast where people can come and really get a top-notch degree at a beautiful place and with some pretty cool people. So that's what's going on at Palm Beach Atlantic.
That's pretty awesome, man.
Yeah,
So you said philosophy, an MA in philosophy of religion.
that's
I
right.
know there are several, philosophy of religion departments or careers or programs out there, if you will. What is unique about this one from your university, from Palm Beach?
Yeah, I mean, I think, all those, we're friends with the folks that teach in all of those at Talbot and elsewhere. And so what would be unique, I mean, are the people that are there, myself and Paul. The focus, like I mentioned earlier, that we're really trying to do something that's cutting edge, that we want to do. We want to blend, and we think that philosophy is a great place to do. Actually, just being a Christian scholar is a great place to do this. We want to blend a robust sense of missional faith with the highest level of academia. That we believe. So, I mean, there's this interesting debate about, should we be excellent in everything we do? And of course, the answer is yes. But I don't think that's the goal. I think the goal is faithfulness to Christ. And when
Hmm.
we're faithful to Christ, a byproduct of that will be almost always that we will be excellent. So that's the goal. We want to be top. We want to be faithful scholars, and we want to have a foot in the academy where we're writing and we're having conversations there. But we want to be for the service of the church and culture at large. So I'd say the missional bent and the academic bent is unique. And just the vision. I mean, we're going to, Lord willing, if God provides funds, we're going to grow our faculty. We're going to grow a lecture series, and we're already talking with some pretty exciting partnerships with different organizations where we're going to be, sending people back and forth from each organization. And so just a vibrant, we want to cash in on that renaissance in Christian philosophy that has been going on for the last couple of decades, and really take that to the next step, where we're not just at the highest seats in the academy and in culture at large, but we're deploying all over our culture so that we can show people the brilliance and the beauty of the gospel at every area of
I
life.
love it, man. It's pretty awesome. And people hearing this, they might want to hear also, what kind of students do you hope to attract? Because it's a beautiful place. It's got
Yeah.
an awesome faculty. So now, what kind of students do you want?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we're housed out of the School of Ministry. So there's actually, if you think, so I went to Talbot School of Theology, and
Hmm.
so when people say, well, where did you graduate? Well, sometimes they say Talbot, but really that's part of Biola
Hmm.
University.
Yeah.
Well, in the same way, Palm Beach Atlantic has their own Talbot School of Theology. Right now it's called the School of Ministry. They have an incredible faculty. There's about 14 of us already. And so you can come and get an MDiv, you can come do all these things. So there's this great infrastructure, and I feel like it's a little known treasure that people are going to begin to discover there, where there's exciting scholarship with vibrant people who love the Lord that are doing scholarship. So that's who we'd like to attract, people that have a sense of mission, sense of vocation, sense of calling, that want to make a difference in culture. And it doesn't have to be the academy, but if you're called to the academy, we can help. If you're called to the church, we can help. If you're
Right.
called to serve, as a doctor, as a lawyer, as a
Mm.
public intellectual, we can help. If you're called to be a creator and to write stories, to write fictions, or to write movies, or to create videos, we can help. We think that all of those areas are there. So I think the kind of student that we would hope to attract are those that have a sense of calling, that want to do some top-notch study, to be grounded theologically, philosophically, apologetically, to make a difference in the world.
Man, that sounds exciting, man.
Yeah,
Definitely, something that we need more and more nowadays.
yeah.
What other dreams? I know you guys are dreaming big, man. So, what other dreams do you have for this program?
We would love to have a center for Christian philosophy that would be, like I said, vibrant. Lectures. I mean, I just think the more that you have conversations like this, at this level, it just elevates all of us, and it awakens, like going back to what we said earlier, it awakens these longings that we all have for goodness, truth, and beauty, which sets us on a journey for Christ. And so I think it honors God when we honor our minds and when we connect it to the things of God. I mean, one of the great things about the doctrine of creation is, if God is the creator of all things, that means that all truths discovered, all knowledge discovered, somehow connects back to and illuminates God. So we'd love to have a center that explores truth in that way, philosophy. We'd love to have, bring in the best scholars, and we're already planning on doing this, to teach May term or J terms. We'd like to have partnerships with apologetic ministries and other departments and other schools, where they come together, and we talk about, how do we, what does faithfulness to Christ look like in our day and age, in the academy, in the church, and so on. And so, yeah, I just think a vibrant move. We want to be part of a movement of God, right? We're not just, well, we are doing philosophy, but we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And
Bigger.
that's the
Yeah.
dream, is to be a part of something that we can only look at it and say, God is on the move, here at Palm Beach Atlantic in the School of Ministry.
Fantastic, and I'm glad that you tell us all of this, because I have some questions from the audience that are
Yeah.
related to pursuing a career in whether it's apologetics or philosophy or theology. But my last question before we open for the Q&A and start asking you some questions from the audience, and it is, I know that this past year you've been a visiting scholar at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. What are you working on, and what other projects are you engage in?
Yeah, this past year, I was a Henry Center Fellow at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And so that's part of what they call the Creation Project. And so working on, well, the technical title was Aristotelian Accounts of Divine Creative Activity. But basically all that is, there's this renewal movement that's going on in theology and philosophy, where we're recapturing some of the, what I would call what many people call some of the ways of conceiving the world that were part of the great tradition, the first 1,500 years of the church, where basically the heavens and the earth were perceived as, enchanted, sacramental theaters of God's glory. So I'm looking at the philosophical side of that, recapturing Plato and Aristotle and integrated it into our faith. And so I'm writing essays on, theism and the nature of nature, and things like that. One of the things that came out of that year that I'm excited for, that I need to finish up in the next year, it actually relates to the Cultural Apologetics book that I wrote. It's a sequel, I guess I would call it, where, remember how I said that we can join with God to re-enchant the world in two ways: one, by seeing and delighting in the world the way Jesus does, and then two, by inviting others to do the same. Well, those are two book projects. And over the next year, I'm just about contracted out to write a book that's a cultural apologetic book, but it's actually for non-believers. And so it's going to be co-published with Thru and another publisher that's a major publisher. And we're just working out the details now. And it's going to be used, which is great, because it goes back to my heart for Thru and college students. It's going to be used as their main evangelistic tool, as a book, an apologetic book, where you're blending image and ideas and story and all these things. So I'm trying to write really creative. It's called 11 Stones. And the metaphor of the book is, that God has given all these clues, these stones all over the world. Mm-hmm. And if we stack them like cairns on a hike, they can function as guides to lead us on our journey to God. And so I'm about halfway through the book, and over the next year I'll be finishing that. And so that'll be one of the things that'll be a fruit of this past year.
Man, you're doing so much, man. It's excited, man. You're busy, right?
Trying to hold it all together
too.
We're moving too. Yeah. In fact, people are on my roof right now as we're talking. CF needs to be replaced as we sell our house.
Yeah. Okay, now, so we're going to open for the Q&A. Make sure you write the word question in all caps in front of your question, and make sure that it's in complete English, and also it's a succinct question. I have no time to read a paragraph out loud for something that could have been redacted in a line or two. So those unfortunately going to be overlooked, but we got some great questions here. And I got one from Cross-Examine Facebook. Anthony de los Santos asks, what advice do you have, Paul, for someone who is considering pursuing a career in apologetics and or philosophy?
That's a great question. I would say start with that and begin to read books, begin to, do things like you're doing, watching, connecting with apologetics ministries, begin doing it, because so for me, one of the things that awakened the initial longing for truth was actually just doing evangelism. And, for me, the minute you start talking about God, ideas come in, and then you're on this, and then apologetics comes into that very naturally. And then examine and pay attention to your heart in the midst of that. So for me, for example, in sharing the gospel in the context of ideas, it awoke something within me. And I can remember we would start doing every week, while I was at camp for a couple of years there, we would do these things called open forums, where we just go into a dorm and say, hey, here's Christianity, for like 3 minutes, and then say, what are your questions? And then we'd spend 3 hours basically talking about evolution and the problem of evil, and what about the resurrection, and just basic apologetics. And I can remember walking out of those at midnight or 1 a.m. every time we did this, and my heart was alive. And I would say, if you're having those same kinds of experiences, paying attention to your longings, your passions, well, that's some indication that it could be part of your calling. So I've heard it said that calling is the intersection of the world's needs, the deepest needs of the world, and your own passions and giftings. And so I would say explore it that way. Read books, get connected with people that and ask them about yourself and your own giftings and what they think God is doing in your life, and then take a step of faith. It could be trying a program or something like that, and in doing that, continue to watch your heart and see what kind of passion surface.
I love it. I do have a shameless plug for you. Let's see what his name, Anthony. The Cross Examining Structure Academy is happening in August in Dallas, Texas. We are getting about 2 applications per day. So we only have 50 spots. It's 3 days intensive training with Frank Turek, Greg Kokel, Brett Kunkel. We have Jay Warner Wallace. We have Dr. Richard Howe. We have Bobby Conway, myself. We're going to have special set with Ed Komocheski. We're probably going to have Dr. Dan Wallace pop in for a couple of days. We're also going to have myself. I'm going to be there doing some training. We're going to have David Wood. So Alisa Childers. We're going to have a lot of people training you one-on-one for 3 days, three 12-hour days where we're going to be not teaching you apologetics, but teaching you how to communicate and be a dynamic and effective communicator of the truth. So Cross-Examining Structure Academy, go to crossexamine.org, click the events tab and go to what is CIA, and you can apply right there. Make sure you hurry up because it's filling up quick. And I think that and I gave a little bit of my testimony on how I started in this whole apologetics journey. People don't know, but I was in a jail cell. I was in a federal facility. And I listened to Ravi on my AM FM radio where I only have one headphone. And actually, I had to sit by the window, which it was about this big and it was about this thick, right? And I would listen to Ravi for 15 minutes every day. And I fell in love with apologetics through his radio ministry. And what I did was exactly what Paul just told you to do. I got connected. I started reading like there was no tomorrow, and I started taking every and any online course on philosophy of science, apologetics, the RCIM Academy, the online courses that Cross Examine made available, the DVDs, and I went to every program like the CIA. I was a CIA student about 6, maybe 7 years ago. Today I'm an instructor, so you can do it, man. Just make sure that you continue to practice and continue to be passionate about this, just like Paul says. Now, I have a great question here, but I just don't have a name, so I'm sorry. It's a question from Cross Examine Facebook, and it says, how can we have, Paul, a genuine missionary encounter in our culture?
Yeah, well, that's partly what I wrote and why I wrote that whole book. It's a long answer, but I would say to keep it succinct. So I would refer you to my book for the full answer, but to keep it succinct, we would want to do maybe 3 things. Number 1, understand the culture you find yourself in, and that can be culture at large, the global culture, but it could also be locally. Like, what culture are you seeking to reach? Is it people that hang out at coffee shops? Is it high school students? Whatever. So, whatever that culture is. So understand the culture you seek to reach. Number 2, and I'm going to just point you to the example of Paul in Acts chapter 17 when he engages the Greeks in Athens. Identify a starting point. And so in the book, I talk about 3 starting points: our universal longings for truth, goodness, and beauty. And then number 3 is build a case by walking up those planks: the plank of reason, the plank of the conscience, and the plank of the imagination. And then number 4, address barriers and obstacles to the gospel along the way. And I've got a great chart. You can see it in the book where I kind of actually map out what that looks like. In fact, I should just show you because it's visuals are so helpful, right? And so here's the visual. If you can see it, see if we can get that up there.
Absolutely.
Right there. There you go.
Right, the other way,
Other way, this way.
That way, yeah, right there.
So there's a little visual. Identify your Athens, find some starting points, build a bridge to Jesus and the gospel, and address barriers along the way.
Awesome, man. Awesome. I got this one, Joshua from the Frank Turek page says, how can we get the general Christian to be more engaged in apologetics?
That's a great question too. I would say it starts with us. So I think, and it starts therefore with you, that you would be passionate about the things of God, that you would be someone who rejects anti-intellectualism yourself, and in a winsome way shows how this stuff actually matters, right? And then just pray that it would become contagious, that as you lead, as you teach, as you are passionate about this, that others would catch on and see that. I think that one of the best ways that we influences others, and this is why I love being a teacher, is that when you're passionate about something, it catches, right? And people
Mm-hmm.
see that and they become interested, and that awakens something within them. So I would say in terms of getting others interested in it is, why don't you start doing that? Maybe you gather people together and do a book, read a book and talk about it. Maybe you gather a Sunday school together and do the same thing. Whatever it is, find ways to, start gathering others, and in doing that, hopefully people will become interested as they see your passion.
Awesome, man. One of the things, I got one more question before I move on to the closing of the program and ask you the question we ask all of our guests here in the Hope One show. I noticed that all of our questions come from people interested in reaching the culture. And I
Yeah.
think it's so amazing that you not only have this great resource, man. I mean, everybody should have a copy of the training and a copy of the book as well. But people are interested in really going out there and getting into the culture
Yeah, I love
and
that.
passing out that good infection that Lewis talked about, to be a force to transform the culture that we live in today. And I got Megan Starr. She asked, Dr. Gould, what recommendation can you give for a middle-aged woman finishing a master's degree in cultural apologetics? I just finished my thesis, praying for the next step. Wow.
Love that. Well, congratulations. That's so cool. As you went to HBU, but I'm just guessing. Yeah, I would say look for the next steps. Pray and be open to stepping out in faith and trying new things. So I don't know exactly what your interest would be if you went there to write, if you went there to start a blog or start a video series, but look for ways that you can apply the things that you've learned in your own sphere of influence, and then just be faithful to that. Right? You don't have to read a book on platforming or whatever like that, but just be faithful to the things that God has called you. And then, like I said to the earlier question, the things that you are passionate about, I think, also are an indication of your calling, and with respect to how you use this. It's okay that you're middle-aged. My wife just finished a degree at DTS in creative writing, and we're
Awesome.
middle-aged too, and she's asking those very same questions. And so what we're encouraging is just to step out in faith and leave the results to God. So try things and be free to fail, because in the trying of it, I think sometimes we discover what that is that God might have for us. So congratulations, and
Mm.
I would love to hear what you end up doing.
Awesome, awesome. So now to top it off, I got one question. This is a close friend. This is a person that I work with shoulder to shoulder every day. And you are a top-notch philosopher, man. So I got to ask this question.
Uh-oh.
Jairo Izquierdo, he is my right-hand man on many things that we do here at Cross Examine and also in other ministries in Latin America. And this guy is sharp. So he asked the following questions. He says, some of the Christian theistic arguments suggest that God is the best explanation of certain facts, like, that God is the best explanation for the absolute beginning of the universe. But in science, I assume he means the physical sciences, and with the passage of time, sometimes the best explanation does not mean that what explains the fact in question is real or exists. For example, the ether. Okay, how can we ensure that this is not the case with God? That although He is the best explanation for certain facts, it does not. This does not imply that He actually exists.
Yeah, that's really good. Wow. I hope I can do justice
Well,
to that.
I told you he's sharp, man, and he's always throw these questions, and I'm like, man, you work with me. I
Yeah,
cannot be asking this stuff here. But he
I
wants an
love it.
audience, and I want to give him one with you because I know you're a powerhouse in the area of philosophy, and you're really winsome. So
Yeah.
hopefully he stopped being grumpy cat in my day to day group after you answered this.
I don't know if I'm a powerhouse in this, but I would say what there's an in behind the question that's really interesting to point out. And that's the fact that inferences to the best explanation are temporal in the sense that it can change, right? So like in science, I think you're right. In science, as facts develop, as we learn new things, as we discover new things about the world, what might have been the best explanation at one time no longer becomes the best explanation. And so that's why we have progress in science, right? That we get closer to the truth. And so that is right. That is something about inductive reasoning in general, is that it's probabilistic, right? You can never know with 100% certainty, but that's okay, I would say. Because when we talk about the theistic arguments, here's the difference, I think. The difference is we're not talking about things like the aether and trying to understand, the nature of space and time. We're talking about things that are what we would call recalcitrant facts. The fact that the universe began, although there is some debate on that one. But the fact, how about that the universe exists, right? There's not a lot of debate on that. That's a pretty recalcitrant fact. Or the fact that there's minds, whether they appeared and local and only here or whatever. These are recalcitrant facts. So we're not talking about things that necessarily science is discovering that there's questions about, but these are all of the theistic arguments are grounded in things that are not very controversial, the empirical premises, right? So you go to the cosmological argument. Here's the empirical premise. The universe exists, or the universe began to exist, depending on your version. Go to the moral argument. What's the empirical premise? There are objective moral facts, right? These are recalcitrant facts. Go to the teleological argument. Now here you get to some things that are a little more debated, right? There's something called intrinsic teleology. Okay, there's something that has been debated for a long time, and so design arguments were all the vogue in the 18th and 19th century, and then you have Darwin, and he supposedly shattered the design arguments and got rid of teleology. But what's interesting, and so at the time, okay, no longer is intelligent design the inference to the best explanation, because now we have Darwin. But now we find ourselves on the other side of Darwin, 150 years, and suddenly teleology is making a comeback. In fact, this was the research topic of my last year at Trinity. Teleology is all the rage, and we can't do good science without teleology. And so suddenly you have a whole species of arguments that are becoming more vogue. Now there's sociological reasons why people don't love them, but that's okay, right? We can sort of work through that. And so I would say, yeah, you're right. There is a tentative nature, maybe especially when we come to biology, for example, but not when we're coming to existence questions or morality or other things like that. So that's a great question. You're right. There's nuance, always is. But we just do the best we can with what we have, and that's what it means to be rational agents.
Awesome, man. And then again, we don't take these arguments isolated either.
That's right.
We take them all as a whole, and we look at, the how it correspond to reality, how they cohere, how they play well together, and that's why we say, hey, no, Christianity, yeah, it's true. But thank you, Paul. It's been amazing. I am so happy that I was able to hang out with you today for an hour. So as we ask every guest in our show, we're talking about philosophy, hope through philosophy, and hope through Christian apologetics. Leave us with a word of hope for all of those who are dealing with the COVID, with the pandemic, those who are being hit economically, those who are having issues because they're sitting at home with their loved ones for so long, and that causes tension. Give us a word of hope, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I've learned a lot about hope in the last couple of years. Actually, been going through some hard things in our own lives, and as I was struggling, I realized that hope is all over Scripture. And I would just say, to keep it short, that we have a living hope because of the resurrection. And that's the good news. And so hope is that virtue that sustains us on the path, on our journey to God, when things get difficult. And so the fact that our hope is a living hope is rooted in the fact that Jesus Christ exists, and Jesus Christ rose from the dead, and he's redeeming all things, including the evil and the suffering and whatever difficulties all of you and all of us are going through right now. Loss is loss, and difficulty is difficulty, whether it's small or big. And so I just encourage you to cling to the fact that Christianity is true, and it is living, and that we serve a living God. So I would leave you there.
Amen. Thank you, Paul. It's been amazing. Look forward to having you again in the Cross Examine Live show as we had planned before. I want to ask everybody to pray for Paul and his family as they move. They make their way to Palm Beach, Florida. I know it's we're gonna be envious of the weather down there and all the sun that they're
Yeah.
gonna be getting, but continue to pray for the program that they're gonna open at the university. Pray for smooth transition. And thank you everybody for watching, whether you're in Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, on our website, on our app, and make sure that you go to Amazon right now and get you a copy of Cultural Apologetics. And if you want to get a degree, a master's degree in philosophy of religion, look no further than just go into is a pba.edu, or you
Yeah.
can contact
Just
Paul.
find me.
Paul,
Yep.
yeah, just contact him, and he can help you. But this has been for today, Paul. Again, thank you, and
You're welcome.
I'll see you guys tomorrow on the Hope One show at 11:30 a.m. Eastern. God bless.
Blessings all.